Have you ever been somewhere that you've always dreamed of going, but then have just been a little bit disappointed with the images that you've got from there? Well, I have, and it can be so frustrating with all the planning and expense that goes into these trips to come home just feeling a little bit underwhelmed with your photography. You might blame yourself or your camera or your skill level, but quite often it's none of these things. As I embarked on a 2,000-mile road trip to Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons, I dove deeper into why I'm often left a little disappointed after trips like these and what I've done differently this year to change that. Channeling my inner Ansel Adams being one of them. This is a trip that really didn't go to plan, but taught me some valuable lessons about travelling with a camera, as I'll explain. I've been insanely lucky with where I've got to take my camera this year. And like a lot of photographers, whenever I'm looking at planning a trip or a holiday or something like that, it's often done with a photo first perspective. I want to be able to make the most of the time I have there by taking images that I like. And like everyone, we see images from fantastic places all across the world on a daily basis, and these directly influence the kind of places where we want to travel to. Like everyone, I dream of shooting these places in dream conditions. That's like the pinnacle of photography to me, and it's why I got into photography, and those kind of things keep inspiring me even now. When I was invited to go and shoot two of the best national parks in the USA, I was straight on that plane, and being able to do it at the height of spring seemed like an absolutely perfect opportunity. That was mistake number one. Let's start with how this came about. This guy is Moley, aka Boom Shidang, who I've known for just over a year. We chat most weeks, and it was his invite to help along with a project that led to this trip being a reality. The project? Well, we'll come on to that shortly. But on the 16th of May, Moley picked me up at Denver Airport, and we drove north to the Grand Teton National Park. Apparently though, the jet lag meant I didn't do anything camera related for the first 16 hours, so I have no footage of this element of the trip to show you. I did take this picture when we stopped to eat, and little did I know that that would pretty much be the best sunset of the week, or the last time I'd have any feeling left in my toes. I don't know if it's something to do with the films I saw as a kid, but the idea of a US road trip is filled with a huge sense of excitement for me. I'm lucky enough to have done Nevada and California a decade back, New England in 2018, and we'll hopefully get up to the Pacific Northwest and the deserts in the near future. There's just something about the straight open roads, the emptiness, the lonely gas stations. It's like a deep sense of nostalgia for the movies that I grew up with, combined with romantic feelings of adventure and freedom. Basically, I was in my element, and I quickly alienated my travelling partner by demanding he stopped every 4 miles so I could take a photo. Wyoming was a bit like a watered down Windows XP, but it's amazing how many things there appealed to my photographic tastes. Taking these next two shots on my first day there was like Christmas. The first one just screams American road trip to me, and the colours in the second one make me feel uncomfortably giddy, as I'm sure you can tell. I like this one so much that I will even release a print of it. But in amongst all of this photographic joy, there was a deep sense of angst, and every time I stepped from the car, it hit me all over again. It was cold, like really fucking cold, and we were heading up into the mountains. It wasn't long before that angst played out in full and we were given a taste of what was to come. The blizzard that hit us thankfully didn't hamper our travel, but did allow me to shoot next year's Christmas card collection. You can see in this one what a difference light makes to photos like this. Something I wish we had more of over the next few days for reasons you'll see. I really like this image, but I find it hard to love. I think that might just be because it feels weird to me. All I can think of when I look at it is, I took this in May, a spring month, and that just makes me feel a little bit disconnected from it, I suppose. You see, the problem was I delegated all of the trip planning to my travel companion who lives in Austin, Texas. Quite a warm place. Positively hot if you're from where I'm from, where it's currently about 13 degrees and keeps raining in mid-June. He, like I, assumed that May is a spring, maybe even late spring month. And given that we weren't heading to Alaska, snow wasn't really a thing that we needed to be concerned with. I mean, why would it be? Well, altitude and geography, namely. For the entire trip, I was higher than the height of Ben Nevis, which is the tallest mountain in the UK. When we came to book our campsites, the issue was that they weren't all booked up as we initially thought. The issue was that they were shut and they didn't open till June. So one lesson for getting good photos on a photography trip is research. I often do this, and for this trip I did. I looked into locations that I wanted to shoot at, but I just didn't think I'd have to research seasons. Well, we'd arrived, and as sitting in the tent wasn't really an option, we headed out and explored in conditions colder than I had in Antarctica earlier this year. Yep, I am still talking about it. Our first point of call was Mormon Row, one of those dreamed of locations I talked about.
It's so cold.
Given winter had come, it quickly became apparent that I wasn't going to get a shot anything like those that I'd seen from here before. Cue disappointment.
It kind of feels a bit surreal being here because I've seen so many pictures of it, and it's like a lot of these places, when you come to it, it's just not quite what you imagine it would be, especially today because it is grey, dull, cold, flat, and I'm going to say sub-optimal conditions for photography. So yeah, slightly anticlimactic.
I mentioned in my chilly video that I've enjoyed shooting in colour a lot more than I used to, but for these it was back to the good old favourite, dark and moody. An appropriate accompaniment to my aforementioned disappointment. I didn't know at the time, but this shot of what I assume is the toilet would start a mini project for the trip. You have to remember that despite the bitter cold and the fact we could barely see the mountains, this might be the only time I get to be here, so you've got to get out and explore no matter what is thrown at you, which in our case was quite a lot. All of the shots I've shown are a delight in their own way just because they were so unexpected. Did I think I'd be shooting in a snowstorm? No, of course I didn't. But I did make the most of it and I tried to capture something unique. The light went pretty flat after this, and shooting in these conditions, especially in the snow, is pretty difficult. Everything just loses its texture, which is why I'm not really showing any images. I like this shot of the cabin and stuck around for a while waiting for someone to turn the lights on, which I think would have really made it. I then remembered everywhere was closed and no one was about because it was winter. So we retreated back to the car park and I ended up with the second and probably second best shot in my toilet series. That night was the coldest I've ever spent in a tent. I think it got down to about -7 degrees centigrade. Despite my winter sleeping bag, the fact I was fully clothed, and the fact I pointed a heater at my feet for half an hour, I was genuinely concerned for a while that I would never regain feeling in them. As you can see though, I still have feet, so please don't be concerned. It was just a bit uncomfortable. I think you can appreciate the cold by looking at our campsite, and despite Molly thoroughly cooking our breakfast, it was almost frozen by the time it hit my mouth. That morning we drove around the park hitting all of the hot spots. On the way back to Mormon Row we got our first sighting of these amazing bison causing a traffic jam. Well, they stopped us in a van. I may have mentioned before that I am no wildlife photographer, but it was cool to see and photograph these majestic beasts. We got a little more mountain visible at Mormon Road than yesterday, and I really like these shots. By now I'd put what I'd seen on the gram behind me and focused on what I could do here and now. I made the most of the conditions, found compositions that I thought suited them, and shot some images that I really like. Yeah, they're not what I envisaged, but rather than let that bother me, I immersed myself in what I love doing. The keen-eyed amongst you might realise that I'm shooting on about 11 different cameras, and I might talk about why in a future video. I don't know who I'm kidding, of course there's interest, this is YouTube and that will gain at least quadruple the views that this will. To save time, I've got a Fuji X-T4, an X100V and a couple of film cameras. I'm going to definitely do a video on the film cameras soon, but haven't decided on the Fuji yet. I'm still not 100% sure where it fits into my workflow. I probably need to spend a bit more time with it to work that out before I want to talk about it. And I don't even know if that's something you want to hear about. Let me know. This toilet photo is a lot shitter than the last, pun intended. The fleeting light in this image made it the best from there, I think, and the image summed up our time in the Tetons well, particularly in those wintry conditions, which were about to change. Yeah, they got worse. We went back to the lake from yesterday, which was actually a lot of fun to try and shoot. Singing and loud talking was advised as we walked the paths to ward off the bears, which I think saw the conditions and probably remained in hibernation. I took a lot of shots here and many of them just didn't work because of the lack of light. I quite like this scene with the light on the mountains in the background, but I'm just not sure it balances properly. I think there's maybe a little too much going on the right hand side. Our next stop was Coulter Bay, a popular boating mecca for those wanting to hit the water. For whatever reason though, it was pretty quiet here. We did some more filming for the project here, and it was at this point where my hands joined my feet in the lack of feeling category. I took a few more shots here, but it was hard. It was cool to see such a place frozen over, and hard to imagine a change that will happen in just a few weeks. The ice had some really cool patterns leading you to the mountains, but I just don't know if you can see enough of it. Might have worked better with a drone, but they're banned in national parks, so you'll just have to imagine. I never really shoot in black and white, but I felt that these conditions lent themselves quite well to it. Not for the last time on this trip. The rest of the day was more driving, more crap toilet photos, and a bear, which I think I captured pretty professionally. It was at this stage that the weather did seem to change a little. Despite everything I've said, the snow of the last few days was unusually late in the season. So we're not entirely to blame for timing it wrong. Or maybe we timed it right and the conditions just allowed us to get something really unique. We did a few more spots that afternoon. Elk Ranch Flats, where we first became aware that the mountains did have tops. And then Snake River Bend, where Ansel Adams shot this famous image. This is where I first tried to emulate my inner Ansel, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree that I nailed it with this shot. I'm not to blame for the trees growing over the last 60 years, that's all I'm going to say. That night's camp was a little warmer at 4 below, and as it looked like we were going to get an actual sunrise the next morning, we had to go for it. Mormon Row for a third time seemed a little cliche, so we decided on Elk Ranch Flats again, followed by the Oxbow Bend turnout. A lot of the locations we did want to go to were inaccessible due to, well, winter. This is where the planning element failed once more.
This is just beautiful. I'm shooting this on all cameras. I'm shooting on my Sony camera, I've got my Fuji camera, I've got this film camera which you'll see in a later video, but after 2 days of cloud and no real sunrise, this is an absolute treat to see. Beautiful.
The sunrise at Elk Ranch Flats was beautiful, if a little difficult compositionally. It was almost too simple and to me lacked something, maybe a cabin or a barn or even some elk, in the mid-ground. I was looking forward to the sun illuminating the foreground grasses, which I think would have really made the shot, but then disaster. Yep, the sun rose directly behind me, which was a problem. It also meant that the mountains quickly lost any definition, so didn't quite get what I was after. I do really like this shot, but as I've alluded to recently, it's not quite the style I'm going for at the moment. We did go on to Oxbow Bend, but the lack of cloud made it hard to keep shooting shots with interest. I've realised of late that I am trying to create shots that evoke some sort of emotion and not just frustration at myself. These are sort of calming but just lack something, they're a bit postcardy. I've had comments of late that I'm too hard on myself, and maybe I am, but I'm just trying to get better at what I do, and I think looking at your own work with a hypercritical eye is the best way of improving. I'm trying to see where I can get better, and as long as I'm not berating myself, I don't really see a problem with that. I realise this video is full of self-criticism, but a lot of it is sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's my self-deprecating British humour, which is defence mechanism, so I don't have to deal with the real problems in my life. Problems like how the f you compose this shot with the cabin. I'm not sure you can, especially not in this light, which is probably why I've never seen an image of it before. I have seen this image though and decided to shoot it anyway, so at least I had something for this part of the video. Whilst yesterday's breakfast was like something from The Revenant, no, not that bit, today's was one of the most memorable I'll ever have. I couldn't think of a better place to throw avocado and egg yolk all down myself. We took in our last few moments in the Tetons before setting off on a long drive to Yellowstone. It's actually quite a short drive to Yellowstone, the south entrance being at the northern part of the Tetons National Park. I'm not sure if I mentioned our poor planning though, but today was Wednesday and the south entrance to Yellowstone had not yet opened for the season. That was something that happened on Thursday. So rather annoyingly, we drove the long way round. Idaho was like a watered down Windows XP, and whilst I largely resisted the temptation to yell stop every 10 minutes, I did make my co-pilot stop to shoot this barn with the western edge of the Tetons in the distance. I really like this shot, and I think I prefer the one where the barn is a little less dominant. It's definitely worth the minor trespassing, which to me seemed like less of an issue than it did to my anxious compadre. It's easy to forget that farmers in the US could probably supply a small battalion, whilst in the UK you're just likely to probably get shouted at. Not that I condone this kind of behaviour, but if you leave a barn like that right next to the road, what do you expect? So, on to the potential life-extincting supervolcano that is Yellowstone. This is somewhere that photographically I mainly associate with wildlife and geysers, or geysers as I was corrected into saying I don't know how many times. I'm not totally interested in shooting either of these things, so I came into this park with a really open mind photographically. And this was sort of the game-changing moment for me that I'll explain shortly. We had a few hours of light left to explore the park when we arrived, but given it's so massive, we barely made a dent. Without any agenda, apart from can we get as far as Grand Prismatic Springs, we stopped every now and then when something caught our eye and got some really cool changeable conditions which were great for shooting these backlit trees. Molly wanted to go for a bit of a hike, but given the amount of bear-related warnings and our lack of bear spray, I was pushing to stay a little closer to the car. As we crossed into the caldera, which is basically a 20-odd mile wide volcanic crater, which is clearly very active and could blow at any moment, it became apparent what an awesome, diverse and almost alien landscape this was. We did get to Grand Prismatic at the peak of golden hour. Totally unplanned, who'd have thought. There wasn't really a sunset forecast, but this was an absolute highlight of the trip. The lighting and conditions were incredible, but not only that, there was just nobody around. We pretty much had the place to ourselves. This did mean I had to take to shooting shadow selfies at times, but it worked out pretty well. I love how my shadow was cast onto the steam coming up from, I think it's Midway Geyser. This one is perhaps one of my favourite shots. It just takes me straight back to being stood there. These boardwalks were great to use as leading lines, and it was cool to be able to isolate subjects, in this case Molly. I did direct him to walk over the boardwalks at times, thinking I could use him as a subject, but it just didn't feel real to me. It just felt a little too contrived, and I'm after more realism in my shots. As it turned into the steam, I composed this, which I love, but just thought it needed someone there. I tried Molly again, but for reasons I've just explained, I just couldn't connect with those images. Then came the mysterious stranger, and I had to work for this next image. The steam kept condensing on the lens and on me. I was soaking, and focusing was near impossible, but everything aligned for this, and maybe this is an all-time favourite. I love the mystery, the light, the colour, and I'm partly putting this down to something I was blaming earlier, a lack of planning. As I said earlier, I came into the Yellowstone element of the trip with a completely open mind, and that's not something I normally do on these kind of trips. I think when you have expectations, when you go somewhere like this, you just need to completely forget them. It's hard to do because you want to make the best images you can in a particular place, but there are so many things that are just totally out of your control. Things like the weather, as we've seen, the wildlife you come across, access to areas that you want to go. So much of it is out of our control, and the sooner we can accept that, the better. There are things you can do to improve your chances of getting good shots, like visiting at the right time of year. But we're still always at the mercy of things that are out of our control. Had we planned better, maybe we'd have come here a month later. But if we'd have come a month later, Yellowstone is somewhere that gets insanely busy in the summer months, and we wouldn't have had this place, Grand Prismatic, to ourselves at this time. If you can accept what's thrown at you and just roll with it, and just immerse yourself in the place you're in and your photography, then I guarantee that no matter what, you can make images with meaning. And that's what it should all be about, rather than having this preconceived idea of, I have to get this shot. If you have that idea, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Having this open mind has made me really proud of the range of images I've taken on this trip. Based on suggestions off the back of my last video, I've decided to make a digital zine of the images captured in the Grand Tetons, in Yellowstone, and on the journey in between. You can use this to look at the images in more detail, or for inspiration in your own photography, or just as a way to support the channel and the work that I do. There's a link to this in the description, and it's only £5. Hopefully this will turn into a bit of a series, and as I go to different places, I'll be able to create more of these zines. Anyway, I got another nice shot of the mysterious stranger before this shot, which I like, but still feels a little bit contrived, but it works. The next morning kicked off with a solid start, and I got this collection of images of this rusting old Ford pickup truck, which feeds into my road trip romanticism. We grabbed some much needed bear spray before heading back into the park and having a hike and doing some filming for the project. We saw no bears. I assumed they were scared of the spray that they knew we had. We then made our way to the Old Faithful Hotel, which was pretty cool. It was kind of like a wooden Hogwarts. After getting a coffee here, the lesser visited Old Faithful Geyser was next on the hit list, which I tried to photograph more environmentally. The conditions weren't great, and I knew I wanted to try and get something a bit different, and voila. I then remembered the old Ansel Adams adage that he often relied on. If it's shite, black and white. And I took this. Before anyone starts hating on me for this, I am joking. Ansel is like the goat of photography. I have had some success in the past shooting in conditions like this in black and white. Using a yellow filter or using the tools in Lightroom, you can really darken down the sky, which I think looks pretty good. Another way to do this in a Fuji camera is to pick the Acros plus yellow film simulation, which I did. Nothing was going to stop these next shots from being shit though, unfortunately, but there you go. This was a day that offered very little photographically, but was rich with experiences, filming for the project, and toilets. Well, one toilet. So, the project. Molly has created this amazing, I don't want to call it a planner because it's so much more than that, but this playbook for creative warriors. I've been using this for about a month now, and the best way I can describe it is it's like having a creative coach, but in book form. It's helped me to see the bigger picture, it's reduced my procrastination, and helped me get projects off the ground that I've been dreaming of for years, like the print store. He invited me over to film some coaching sessions and supporting materials for the playbook, and I'd honestly describe that experience and the use of this as life-changing. So, if you're interested in implementing creative practices that last a lifetime, Molly has done viewers of this channel a special offer to purchase the playbook, and the link to all that and more information about it is in the description below, so please check it out because this thing is incredible. Back to Yellowstone. Sunset that night was as you'd expect from a near cloudless day, and we weren't in the best location anyway because, yeah, no planning. Molly did try his hand at a bit of ice fishing though. It's a selfie stick. Forgive him. And I like how the moon was framed by the clouds here, but this was more about being alone on a sandbar with my friend in one of the most incredible places on Earth. We'd come to our final full day in Yellowstone. A day of more bison traffic jams, more toilets, and more alien landscapes. I made a few mistakes on this day, but they can often give us unexpected results, which I was about to find out. Our first stop was this place that just didn't photograph well, and our second was this that also didn't photograph well. I guess it wasn't helped by the fact it was blazing sunshine, totally clear and 20 degrees. We'd somehow missed spring and gone straight through to summer. Last week I received a new book, Stephen Shaw's Uncommon Places, and found he shot Yellowstone himself. Unbeknownst to me, I'd taken the 2024 version of that shot just a few weeks prior. A shot that I'm sure won't be impacting people in a similar way 45 years from now. We continued driving north to Mammoth Springs, which you'll be surprised to know was equally hard to shoot. Given the size of the park, where we were staying, the fact that the primary reason for us being there was filming the project, and that we had a 600-mile drive ahead of us tomorrow, we just had to accept that we couldn't get to the best places at the best times of day. I think when you go on trips like this, sometimes that's just a reality that you have to deal with and you just have to make peace with. But I was still, like I say, really keen to adapt to that and just shoot what I could in the time we had available. And adapt I did near the northern terraces of Mammoth Springs. I love this shot and I think black and white really suits it. I paid a lot of attention to where everything was placed here, and sometimes the temptation in the middle of the day is just to snap and go. The resulting image is just something I really like, and there's also a couple of others from there that work in their own way too. There are a few frames I shot on the drive back south that I also like. This one's really pleasing to me from a compositional point of view. We then got to Norris Geyser Basin, where I messed up not once, but twice. Somehow I overexposed practically everything without realising. But actually I think it kind of works and complements the conditions. Obviously there's technical flaws with these images in terms of clipped highlights, but I think compositions are generally good, which makes them work. I might be talking total shit though. Let me know. The second failure was something I really should have learned from by now: sunburn. How do you sunburn the back of your hands? We had one final place to cross off our list that day: Yellowstone Falls. Yellowstone Falls was really quite hard to shoot. I know I keep coming back to it, but the clear blue skies made it really difficult. As well as there being zero cloud interest, it just meant there was no reflected light into a very contrasty canyon. The second issue was what I think is the best viewpoint was closed. This one in the bottom of the shot here, because, you know, winter. Still, it was an incredible sight to behold and a great place to watch the sun come down, as the distant sound of boulders clattering down the cliffs gave a clue as to how much change this area undergoes. Dinner that night was a bear-enticing riverside Mexican-style steak, which, despite all the warnings, enticed no bears. As we drove out the park that night, we witnessed not one, but two once-in-a-lifetime events. Is that possible? The first one you'll have to take my word for, because I have no footage or images of it at all, but a full-on meteor appeared in the sky straight in front of our car. It lasted about 1 or 2 seconds, just this bright light in the sky that then burnt out. I did think we were under attack for a minute, but thankfully not, but it was just an absolutely mind-blowing thing to see. The second was shared with pretty much the entire population of the Northern Hemisphere. It was the night that the Northern Lights kicked off everywhere, and we got it as far south as wherever we were in Idaho. I grabbed a couple of shots by the roadside, and I quite like these, but we probably weren't really in the right spot, and we just couldn't really stay out. That was because our final full day had arrived, and what better way to spend it than by driving 600 miles to as near to Denver as we could get. The quickest route back was through Yellowstone, where I finally walked as far as Grand Prismatic. I didn't actually get as far as the spring last time when we were there in the evening. As you can see though, it was well worth it, and we timed it pretty well again. I managed to get a couple of shots isolating people with the great plumes of steam behind, and I love this one of this guy and his son. Feels like a really nice father-son adventure, which I can really connect with. As the south entrance was now open, we were able to drive back through the Grand Teton National Park, stopping a couple more times to add to the toilet collection amongst other shots. I tried to keep my mouth shut in the main on the way back, but I had marked a couple of places on my map as we passed them 6 days before. I really like these shots, and to me they just convey that American road trip romanticism I spoke about earlier. Unfortunately, one of the best sunsets of the trip was whilst we were in the ass end of nowhere, southern Wyoming. A much needed hotel room was home for the night before we explored the sights of Denver the next morning before catching my flight home. I'll probably go into the Denver shots in more detail in a future video, so hit subscribe if that's something you'd like to see. I did get some pretty cool shots there though. As the trip ended, I've been left reflecting on what's been an absolutely incredible few months of photographic and creative rejuvenation. I wish I'd paid a little bit more attention to video on this trip, but the priorities were the project and then, to me, my photography. As I do this more and more, I realised that to do one thing well, other things must suffer, and in this case it was the video element. Despite my love of video, photography will always be my number one, and hopefully the images that I've shown in this video and have put in my zine convey this message. Like I said, the link to the zine's in the description below, and I'd also be delighted if my fellow creatives out there could join me on the journey with Moley's playbook. He's put so much work into this book, and it has already completely blown open my creative possibilities. All that's left to say is, where next? Any suggestions are welcome. Thanks as always for watching. I appreciate everyone that does, everyone that comments, everyone that likes. It really means a lot to me.
There's a bison over there stopping anyone getting past in either direction.